This is a Squiz podcast. We're your shortcut to being informed. The weekly wrap is the week in news and what's coming up. I'm Kate Watson.
And I'm Claire Kimball.
We've said this a bit lately. It's been a huge week in news. The escalation of the conflict in the Middle East, another assassination attempt on Donald Trump, and a stoush over housing policy in the Senate.
Yeah, that's going to flow through to next week as the Reserve Bank gets ready to consider interest rates again. Also in what's coming up, we're combining international diplomacy with footy finals.
Our favourite way to do it. I've also got a recommendation. I think it might be my strongest recommendation I've ever made for something. It's not even news related.
You're very passionate about this one.
I am. Stay till the end to hear that. Let's get into the news.
Iron ore is a big deal in the energy transition because it's used to make infrastructure, such as wind turbines and solar panels. When it comes to producing iron ore responsibly, it's happening now at BHP.
We had a discussion about the news list this week, and it was quite remarkable to think that an assassination attempt on a potential president wasn't going to be the biggest story. But that is, in fact, what happened. Leading the news are the bomb attacks using thousands of Lebanese armed groups' pages and radios.
Yeah, so you and I were in the office on Wednesday. We were chatting about exactly what that was. We'd both had very busy mornings.
It kind of passed us by for a second.
We got to the late morning and both of us went, can see the pictures of this explosion. Have you clocked what actually happened? And it didn't take too long then once you actually tuned into it to go, oh, gee, that's a whole thing. So what has happened? Lots of details still to be confirmed, but what we do know is that pages used by members of the terror group Hezbollah exploded in Lebanon from the Beirut capital through to the regions where Hezbollah are in big numbers. Killed 12, injuring more than 2,000. That was in that first attack using pages. The next day, 25 people were killed, at least 600 injured as their walkie-talkies exploded.
Yeah, so cue fingers being pointed at Israel, of course. It's not claimed responsibility for the explosions. Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant this week announced a new phase in the war, though. There's a bit to unpack here more broadly, but first, let's get a better understanding of how this attack was actually carried out.
Yeah, a lot more will be said about it, but from the footage, some of the explosions happened when the pages rang. So those targeted were putting their hands on them to reach for them and pulling them up to their faces as well to check the screens. There are videos also showing individuals with very big gaping wounds in their hips, so the pages sort of being on that belt and pocket region.
Where they were likely being worn, yes. The blast didn't appear to cause major damage to buildings or start any fire. There was a bit around that the devices were made by a Taiwanese company, but as we sort of got through the week, we see the New York Times reporting that the devices were made by a Hungarian firm, BAC Consulting. It says it's part of an Israeli front.
Yeah, Apollo Gold was the name of that Taiwanese company. It had their branding on these devices and it said it had nothing to do with us, that actually it sort of licenses out its label.
To this Hungarian company.
And it pointed the finger at them. What those reports from the New York Times say is that there been great efforts to hide the ownership of that BAC consulting firm, that it was one of at least 3 shell companies. So the creation of these companies hide the fact down the chain that it's actually Israeli intelligence personnel who were behind the manufacturing of those devices.
That Israeli intelligence agency is called Mossad. We're doing our shortcut on that next week. I feel like that will be particularly high level because finding anything out about a spy agency can be quite difficult.
Yeah, I don't think you're going to get any world-breaking news cracking open Mossad from Squiz Shortcuts.
But you might get an understanding of who they are and what they do and why they're accused of this, I guess. As I said, Israel's not fessing up to any of this, to the broader implications, let's just step it back and talk about who Hezbollah is. I think we've done this before, but just quickly again.
So Hezbollah, like Hamas, they're a political and a fighting wing that are in those areas. So Hezbollah, a military group, it's considered a terrorist organisation by Australia, the US, the UK, Germany, Canada, plenty of others. Hezbollah has thousands of fighters. It has a huge missile arsenal based in southern Lebanon. That, of course, is with the support of Iran. They're no slouches. Hezbollah is one of the most heavily armed, non-state military organisations in the world.
We recommended that Four Corners episode a few weeks ago that came out of Iran and talked a lot about the power of Iran and the power of Hezbollah and just how they are well-resourced. If you want to revisit that, we'll pop a link to your episode notes. It's worth resurfacing. But to go on, Hezbollah continues to oppose Israel's presence in those disputed border areas. That cross-border fighting between Israel and Hezbollah has significantly escalated over the past 11 months, of course, because of the war in Gaza.
Yeah, and this is really where the rubber hits the road when we're talking about this fear of a wider conflict in the Middle East. What Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah said this week, this is the quote from him, "There's no doubt that we've been subjected to a major security and military blow that is unprecedented in the history of the resistance and unprecedented in terms of the history of Lebanon."
He also said the attacks crossed all red lines. He said they could be considered war crimes or a declaration of war. That statement in particular is quite pointed. Coming back to something I mentioned earlier, Israel's Defense Minister Yoav Gallant said its war in the region is entering this new phase. Like, what is the insinuation there?
Yeah, so what he said, the centre of gravity is shifting to the north through the diversion of forces and resources. So what he's saying is Israel is sending more troops there. It's putting a lot more attention from that fight against Hamas in the south to the north to exactly push back on Hezbollah in the way that we saw this week. And as he indicated, this escalating tit-for-tat airstrikes that have already happened, they're going to increase in the coming weeks and months. That has really been stepped up because the Israelis in that part of the world have had to evacuate.
Yeah, so it's important to note, obviously, the geography. So northern Israel shares Lebanon's southern border. For Israelis in the area, they've been evacuated and aren't able to return to their homes. That's putting a lot of pressure on Benjamin Netanyahu to act. He said, and Gallant has also said, that our goal is to ensure the safe return of Israelis' northern communities to their homes.
Yep. So for the interim, though, lots of strikes, lots of fighting, fierce. As we're heading into closing out the week, it's prompted lots of calls from world leaders and the United Nations, of course, for all sides to cool it. The United Nations boss is Antonio Guterres. This week he asked for help from powers from the region as well to do their bit to try and make sure that it doesn't blow out. He said, enough of the daily horrors, enough of the suffering.
The message isn't landing, though. Israel has upped its attacks. That's set to continue. Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah has hinted that retaliation is on the cards. He said, one day the enemy will hit us and the next we will hit the enemy. Plenty of other news to get across this week. As we mentioned at the top, there was another assassination attempt on Donald Trump, this time at his golf course in Florida.
No assassination attempt on a current or former president, in Trump's case, a presidential candidate, has happened in 40 years. So
now we've had two.
Now we've had two within months. The Secret Service agents there spotted a barrel of a gun poking out of the bushes. They shot at the suspect. He dropped his AK-47 style assault rifle. He was tracked down and arrested about half an hour later.
His name is Ryan Wesley Routh. He's 58 years old. He's from Hawaii. He has a criminal history. He's been a staunch supporter of Ukraine. Reports say he's been attempting to recruit foreign fighters to get there to fight against Russia. He apparently has also written a self-published book urging Iran to assassinate Trump. As for his politics, reports say he was originally a Trump supporter who had become disillusioned.
And from there, of course, as these things go, heaps of conspiracy theories flying about exactly what was behind all of that. One pointed fingers at the Democrats and at the US government because the thinking went, how did Ralph know that Trump was going to be playing golf? Surely that leak came from the Secret Service and the US government. It wasn't listed on his public schedule.
So many conspiracy theories again, just like the last time. This comment from one of the security experts maybe summed it up for people. He golfs all the time, so it doesn't take a neurosurgeon to figure out that if he's down at Mar-a-Lago and it's nice weather, he's probably going to go to a golf course. That is true. He does golf a lot. A lot, though, has been said about that challenge and whether the Secret Service is doing a good job at protecting him.
Yeah, for his part, though, Trump praised the Secret Service again and said that they're doing an excellent job. There were pictures of him with his agents that went out on his social media channels, thanking them for that. But he's again blamed the Democrats for both assassination attempts. He said their rhetoric is causing me to be shot at.
Yeah, his campaign released a list of quotes from Democrats that said they're inflammatory. On top of that list was a quote from Vice President Kamala Harris saying Trump is a threat to our democracy and fundamental freedoms. Of course, the Democrats have refuted all of this.
Yeah, exactly. And Harris said in a statement, violence has no place in our country. She called Trump after that assassination attempt.
Now that they know each other.
Now that they know each other. They met in person for the first time last week and now they're calling each other. Isn't that nice? Look, she just said that she wanted to check in that he was okay. And remember, there's another guy who's actually the president of the United States.
I had that thought this week when, in fact, the Squiz Today newsletter referenced Kamala Harris's response to what's going on in the Middle East because, you know, she's kind of like
the axis is tilted, hasn't it?
Yeah, we kind of care what she says a lot more than what Joe Biden says. But yes, he is still president.
He is still president. What he said is, thank God the president is okay.
Yeah, the wider context here, of course, though, is that we're 7 weeks away from a US election.
It's extraordinary. Yeah, it's coming down the barrel very, very quickly. And after the first assassination attempt, there was lots of speculation about the incident actually helping Trump's re-election chances. Doesn't seem that way this time around.
Yeah, just according to the commentary, of course. To wrap it all up, Routh is facing multiple firearm charges. He's due back in court next week where there might be more charges laid. Back here in Australia, double dissolution election talk. We going there?
That made me really itchy this week. I don't have time for an Australian federal election.
You said this.
Year.
We have planned our content out and it doesn't fit into our content plan to have an election this year.
It really doesn't.
We're not okay with it.
So even speculation about a double dissolution election makes me really quite irritable. Anyway, look, I'm reconciled that what Anthony Albanese has said is that he wants to go full term.
Yeah.
He doesn't want to do this. However, this week he didn't rule out a double dissolution election.
So just to explain it, we have 3-year terms of federal parliament, but if the government can't get legislation through the parliament, it can call an election at any time. There's a few rules around it. It's that's the top line view, the helicopter view, but because it can get quite technical. But it did come up this week over the Albanese government's housing legislation. They couldn't get through.
And Kate, this is where I really love drawing all of these strands together. So if that's sort of come out of the blue for you, it actually hasn't because you've got this. We've been having these discussions
Explain
for a
why.
while. So first of all, the housing crisis. We've been talking about that quite a bit around Australia's population, around migration issues, around what happened during COVID. We've talked about all of that. We've talked about the party's policies and the budget and exactly what the outcome is of all of that is now going through into this legislation. So we've been through all of that. Mm-hmm. We've also got across Claire O'Neill, who was moved from the Home Affairs portfolio into the housing portfolio as part of that reshuffle a few weeks ago. What Prime Minister Albanese said is that wasn't a demotion because housing is super important. Squizzes are up for this. We're on top of it.
I think we're on top of this discussion. This is in the news this week because Labor wanted the Senate to pass its legislation that would establish the Help to Buy scheme. What that scheme does is the government would support up to 40,000 first home buyers with smaller deposits into the property market. So helping them get into the property market.
Yeah. Basically being a co-owner of their first home. So the government doesn't have the numbers in the Senate to do that. The coalition, the Greens and other senators teamed up for the debate to be deferred for 2 months. As for the coalition's opposition, they just disagree with the whole principle of the government having a hand in someone's financing for their homes, full stop. They're just not coming at it. The Greens say that they've actually got other priorities when it comes to housing. They don't think the bill's good enough. They want the government to offer more for housing support.
Yeah, the Greens have been a big focus of this week. They're really making a stand on this one. This week's events potentially have more to do with politics than policy, though.
Really does. So the government wanted the bill to be voted down so it would have this double dissolution trigger. As you said earlier, we won't get into the technicalities of all of that, but it actually has to have a bill knocked back a couple of times
in order for them to be able to
have that trigger. So it wanted it voted down because it wanted to be able to accuse the coalition, the Greens, of standing in the way of helping the housing market, helping renters buy a home, those sorts of things. For the coalition and the Greens part, they've got their own housing agendas. So this is something we're going to be talking about quite a bit in the coming weeks and months.
If you're listening to us chat about this going, God, that's just the politics, but like what are their policies? Because I'm going to have to decide and then I'm going to have to vote on this. That is the kind of content we're planning for an election. So whether it's this year or next year, you can be guaranteed that what we will do is not just bring you the politics, but make sure you understand this is the government's policy on housing. This is the coalition's policy on housing. This is the Greens' policy on housing. This is whoever else's policy on housing, so that you can understand the actual policy and make a decision for yourself. But understanding the politics is important.
Yeah, and just flagging, I don't have time to do all of that this year. So
No. So Anthony, if you're listening, next year would be good. Final story, the 2026 Com Games has found a home in Scotland. It's going to be hosted by Glasgow, to be specific. This is been a long time coming.
What has happened is very cheeky.
Let's go through it.
Yeah. So it was July last year. The Victorian Premier Daniel Andrews scrapped the Victorian Commonwealth Games. It was going to, be across a lot of regional cities, multi-cities, 20 sports large, 9 parasports as well. The Glasgow model is just going to have 10 sports, and what they'll be, not quite sure yet.
Not quite sure. A really nervous time for sports who don't know if they'll be included. Athletics and swimming are foundation sports for the Com Games, so they're in.
Oh, you've got to have swimming. Like, we're going to win all those,
well,
so we've got to have those.
We do pretty well in the athletics too, so
True.
They're in. But for the rest, it really is up in the air at the moment. We're waiting on confirmation from the local organising committee. Sports are jostling. We saw across the news this week organisations like Netball Australia making its case for its sport to be included in the Games.
Yeah, so sports like netball, to be in the Commonwealth Games is the pinnacle for them. That's the highest level that they'll be able to have an opportunity to compete at. So they really want to be there. From what we've read, looks like individual sports are likely to be prioritised due to the need to use the existing venues that they've got there in Glasgow.
Yeah, so it definitely, as I said, is a wait and see. The other way they're saving costs, Claire, and we're getting into the cheekiness of it now, is that athletes will be housed in local hotels. Ceremonies will be scaled down. There will be no cost to the Scottish taxpayer, according to the Scottish government.
They're going to use Victoria's money that they had to pay in compensation for scrapping the Games.
Yeah, so just explain that a little bit.
Very, very cheeky. So the Victorian government had to pay cancellation fees when it decided that it wasn't going to run the Commonwealth Games anymore. And what it looks like is there's bits and pieces on the edges of it. There's things like security that has to be paid for, so there's a bit of a question about some of that. But the bulk of the money that the Scottish government will use comes from the cancellation fees that the Victorian government have had to pay.
Yeah, that's right. So it's $4.5 million from the local Commonwealth Games Association. It's $200 million from the Commonwealth Games Federation. And then, as you say, the UK government has agreed to fund the security effort that might be needed for hosting an event like this, especially because those costs are going up with increasing security threats. Commonwealth Games Scotland will fund the rest from tickets and merchandise sales. So that's how they're saying that there'll be no cost to the taxpayer over there.
And when they were sort of speculating about all of this, whether they would have a go, it's like, how can we say no? Like, we're not really having to pay for anything much. It's going to be great for Scotland.
At the end of the day, it's a big change for the Commonwealth Games more broadly, and it's a really big rescue effort for the Games.
A message from BHP. Reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the production of iron ore is critical. That's why BHP has committed to a solar and battery agreement to help power their port facilities at Port Hedland. It's happening now at BHP. Visit bhp.com/ironorecritical to find out more.
When it comes to skincare, you shouldn't have to choose between the stuff that works and what you can afford. That's why we've partnered with Go-To. There's no baffling science, no fluff with Australia's go-to for skincare. Just seriously effective products that make your skin and wallet happy. Level up your routine at gotoskincare.com. Coming up this week, AFL and NRL finals, September, the best time of year. Sorry for anyone who's not into sport, but it's going to dominate the news.
It's a big part of this time of year, that's for sure. So in the NRL, we're into week 2 of the finals. This weekend, the Sharks are up against the Cowboys. Kate, I imagine your household's pretty happy. Manly,
yeah.
Still in the mix.
Fantastic. They had a win last weekend. They're taking on the Roosters. As for the AFL, last night the Sydney Swans played Port Adelaide. I'm sure they won. Today the Geelong Cats face the Brisbane Lions. The winners will be our grand final teams. It's also the Brownlow Medal on Monday night, Claire.
Football's night of nights when it comes to the AFL, the red carpet glam. I reckon there'll be some sort of gallery for Squiz Today readers, that's for sure.
Yeah,
probably
Tuesday
put that
morning
in the podcast as well, I think.
Yeah.
That's going to be a whole thing.
Absolutely. If you're wondering who might win the Brownlow, I just checked the betting markets. Patrick Cripps from Carlton is the favoured, but anything can happen on the night.
Yep.
Also starting this weekend, moving away from sport, is the Quad Leaders Summit. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese will be meeting with the leaders of the US, India and Japan, that's the Quad, in Delaware in the US to discuss stability in the Indo-Pacific region. You can expect lots of talk about China.
Lots of talk about China. It's also the Quad's last meeting for Joe Biden.
Is that why it's in Delaware?
In his home state.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I wondered that.
You would bring them there, I guess.
Well, I mean, you
Go
don't have to
crazy.
go. Yeah, if you're already hanging out there and you
It's
don't
probably
really
got
want to go that far.
A couple of restaurant recommendations, that sort of thing. Outgoing Prime Minister from Japan, Fumio Kishida, that's going to be his last one too.
So 2 retiring leaders.
Big turnover.
I think they'll have a bit of a celebration about that.
Yep.
On Tuesday, RBA Governor Michelle Bullock will announce the latest interest rate decision. All things are pointing to no change.
No change, couple of bits of data to point to. So the Australian Bureau of Stats put out our employment data this week. We actually added jobs to the economy in August, so that's further fueled the idea that actually the economy's still booming along a little bit to a degree where inflation's not going to come down. It's one of those input bits of data. So that's certainly one of the cases for no change. Also, the US Federal Reserve, the other bit of big news this week, it's of course, America's version of the Reserve Bank. On Thursday, they cut interest rates by 0.5 percentage point. It's a big deal, of course, because America is so influential when it comes to global economies and settings. The UK, the EU, Canada, China, New Zealand, now the US are jurisdictions where interest rates are coming down. Australia's aren't.
We're the last man standing. So who knows, maybe we just lag a little bit behind everyone else. We do in other things.
Yes.
True. Just general trends.
Well, we get movies at the same time these days.
That's
we don't
true.
lag in that.
Yeah, but
other things we do.
Whether we will follow and how quickly we might follow is something that's been discussed a lot this week.
Yep.
On Wednesday, it's the start of the UN General Assembly debate. You put this one in, I think, Claire.
Yeah, so the UN General Assembly goes for a full month and a bit when it comes together every year. There's a particular week or 2, 10 days or so, where the leaders tend to gravitate towards it, and it's when big speeches are made about what's going on in the world. So, yeah, keep your eye out for a lot of those big speeches this week.
The theme is leaving no one behind, acting together for peace, sustainable development and human dignity for present and future generations. I feel like they could have maybe shortened that up.
That's a very long headline.
We could have helped them shorten that up, I reckon.
It's like a whole committee put that together.
Yeah, imagine the decision to just set the theme. That would have been quite something. Also on Friday, a reminder, it's a public holiday in Victoria ahead of the AFL Grand Final on Saturday. It's also the last day of the school term for kids in the ACT, New South Wales, Tasmania and South Australia. Squiz recommends. I'm flush this week with recommendations, Claire. I've got too many.
Awesome. Go for your life.
Do you want me to? I'll start off with my
Let's do it.
Well, I'd sent you something that I wasn't going to recommend, but you said maybe you should recommend that.
I was like, I'm only sort of about a quick skim read through it and I'm hooked. I'm going to go back and read it straight away.
It's an article by the Free Press about Ryan Routh, the man who is accused of that assassination attempt on Donald Trump. It's titled, "Why Did Journalists Take Routh Seriously?" And it explains how this journalist had interviewed him about Ukraine and about his approach and about him trying to recruit fighters and about who he is and what he stands for, and how other journalists across a lot of major news organisations had taken his view very seriously and spoken to him as far as their media coverage. And it really questions why they didn't realise that he was someone who might be an assassin. Potentially.
And of course they didn't have access to his criminal record or into his brain to, exactly where was he coming from on some of these things. But yeah, super interesting.
But it questions whether they maybe should have dug a little bit deeper.
A little bit more.
Dug a little bit deeper. The other recommendation that's really newsy is a speech by the head of news at the ABC, Justin Stevens. Our mate Lee Sales shared this and I gave it a read. He spoke at the Melbourne Press Club. He doesn't do speeches much. It's incredibly personal. The speech. It's also an insight into his approach to news at the ABC. There's lots of criticism of the ABC and the way they do news, and I think this is a really interesting read from the person who's in charge of setting the tone, I guess.
At any time in the organisation's life of the ABC, being the director of news is a huge job. It's particularly a huge job at the moment. So if you're interested in the way news happens and particularly the ABC's role in that, Justin Stevens is the guy to hear from.
Yeah, and it is, as I said, a very personal story as well. Do you want to do yours before I do mine?
No, I'm parking mine. I'm taking that. I'm cutting and pasting it into next week's rundown.
My strong recommendation is for a packet of potato chips. I love potato chips.
Chips, not crisps.
Well,
chips.
No, crisps, chips, like
in the packet.
Smiths
not
or whatever.
Hot chips.
There is a new entrant in the market. It's a New Zealand chip. It's Great Uncle Kenny's Snackachangi, I think they're called.
Okay.
I found them at a tiny little coffee shop in Bilgola, up in the Northern Beaches in Sydney where I live. They're the best thing I've ever tasted as far as a potato chip goes. Zoe Foster-Blake also shared them on her Instagram, so I know this is a thing.
Yes.
And I just want squizzers who are as enthusiastic about potato chips as me to know that these are here. They've arrived in Australia. I'm not sure where you can get them outside of this one coffee shop in Bilgola, but I reckon they're going to explode into the Aussie market.
Well, they are now. Kate Watson on the Squiz saying these are a thing.
Oh, they're the best. They're the best chips I've ever had.
Well, and that's just for anyone who needs to know, that's a very strong recommendation from you because you're a proper chip fan.
Well, go to our Instagram page because we're sharing a photo of them, and because I can't tell you where to buy them.
Yeah,
they're
a bit niche at the moment.
They seem a bit niche at the moment, but I think they're going to start to really make their mark.
Yeah, I'm on the hunt.
I'll bring you some next week.
Oh, that'd be amazing.
Just quickly before we finish up, Squiz Press, we had a big industry event this week.
Yeah, so the Digital Publishers Alliance, which we've talked about a couple of times, got together 300, 400 odd media buyers at a big thing. Upfronts, they're called, here in Sydney. The Digital Publishers Alliance has about 60 publishers on board, lots of titles. So from Mamma Mia through to Broadsheet, through to all sorts of shameless media, lots of really high quality Galah, who we love, lots of great brands. And Kate, you did an excellent job presenting to all those people what we do at the Squiz and what the opportunities are.
It was all about strength in independent media. We used a lot of the information from what you, Squizzers, have told us about how much you value independent media in a world where there's so much mis and disinformation coming at us, and how much you trust us. So thank you for completing our survey. Thank you for talking to us about how much you care about what we do, and particularly about our work in media literacy and teaching the next generation of news consumers as well, because I was able to pull that all together and demonstrate that we're a really great place for brands to be. So more than anything, just a thank you to Squizzers for being part of it.
Yeah, thanks for that. We do, all of those surveys that you fill in do actually really matter for us.
We've got lots of results of those up on our Instagram page and LinkedIn page today too, if you want to have a look at how you're feeling about things. That's all for us this week. Thanks for listening to this episode of Weekly Wrap. We'll be back next week.